Identity federations come in many shapes and forms. You may say different architectures. And let's have a look at the three predominant architectures. First of all, I would like to introduce you, of course, to the basic principle which applies to all the architectures that we talk about. So you as a user use your browser. This is web-based. You go to a service. The service redirects you to a where are you from service. You choose where you come from. You go to your institution, the identity provider. You log in. The authentication takes place there. And the information about you is handed over from this identity provider to the service provider. A widely used architecture is the loosely coupled federation, or you could call it full mesh model, where everybody can actually make peer-to-peer connections directly. The where are you from service may be implemented centrally by the federation operator, so you can just redirect as you saw it in the diagram before, or it may be implemented in the service provider's installations. So they can keep a tailored local where are you from service which fits their customer base, for instance, more neatly than the complete list of all participating identity providers. This architecture relies on one common protocol which everybody must implement, and that's of course a constraint. So you don't have multi-protocol support in this setup. You do have direct connections, and therefore you can trust that there will be nobody listening to the traffic going back and forth in this setup. A completely different setup, which is also implemented, is a hub and spoke model where you have a central federating entity, which says wayf in the middle here, the where are you from service, and then you have single connections to each service and to each identity provider, in this case institutions. And then an important feature of this setup is that you have a centralized authentication mechanism, a centralized login system, so the institutions just keep the user data decentral at their premises, and then you have outsourced, so to speak, or you have one common login mechanism. Now, one of the good things about this is that you have protocol independence. You can upgrade or downgrade or just change any of these links to services and institutions as you like, and nobody else will notice. What makes this so different from the previous architecture we saw is, of course, that you have a trusted third party through which all the authentication requests and all the user information goes back and forth. So everybody must really trust this, and it's important that you have this in mind when you build such a structure. Not everyone likes to have a common authentication mechanism, and therefore a third variant of this setup exists, and this is the one implemented by wayf in Denmark, where you have services, of course, connected to a central federation hub, and then you have decentral user information at the identity providers, and you have decentral authentication mechanisms. So, for instance, a university may implement its own authentication mechanism. It might be username and password, it might be fingerprint, it might be digitally signed signatures or whatever. And here you have the protocol independence. You have attribute value checks done by the federating operator. You have multi-protocol support. And you also, for instance, in inter-federation setups, you have a single point of contact where you can add this federating component, the wayf in the middle, to other contexts, and actually neither the services nor the institutions need to do anything in that regard. They just have a wider scope all of a sudden broadened out. So you can use this also as a border element to other federations. Interfederation is the question of how to interconnect federations, identity federations in this case. So let's have a look at how you may interconnect federations. First of all, let's make it clear that we have many federations. So look at the landscape here, and you can see that all the way from Iceland to Australia, Japan, and many places in Europe, we have identity federations. They usually come in as national entities for traditional and historical reasons. Now, like the internet, we want to interconnect these bubbles or green circles of trust, and that is interconnecting. or interfederation. One example is the Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union, the first one, was many hundred years ago a union of Scandinavian countries. Now we have built the second Kalmar Union, and the second Kalmar Union takes off in the same geographical area, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland and Denmark, but now we have interfederated the National Identity Federation so we can get across each other's countries and access services across these borders. So this is the Kalmar Union #2 logo, and you may actually go to kalmar2.org and get more information about how it was set up, what the business drivers were and so forth. Also, of course, the technical setup, and it's not confined to the Scandinavian area. You may also become member of Kalmar Union if you live up to, well, the rules. So there's actually a memorandum of understanding and charter behind all of this. This is the foundation, this is the paperwork that you, and the rules and all of that, regulations that you have to have in place in order to actually trust information that you receive from other countries. You must also observe, of course, regulations about personal data, management of personal data. May you actually transport it and so forth. It's not as beautiful as the old one, which you see here, which had many Laker seals and everything on it, but it's actually working, and now we have this federation operating since 2 years. Now, the basic concept is exactly the same as the local identity federation, so let's just go very quickly through it. You go to a service as a user in the middle here, you go to a service, but this service may be a service in Finland. Let's take that example. Then you're redirected to a where are you from service, which gets slightly complicated compared to the national ones, because here you have to choose which country you come from, and then in turn which institution or identity provider you come from. But you do that, and then you go to an institution in Denmark, which is of course connected through wayf. You log in, and the information is handed over to the service, which can then authorize you or not. We've, in one of the other presentations, had a look at identity architectures. And one of the interesting things about the Kalmar 2 Union is that we actually intertwine or interfederate 3 different architectures. We have here the Norwegian one with a central login service and a hub and spoke model. We have the Swedish and Finnish full meshed shibboleth-based federations, and we have at the bottom there the wayf model, where you have decentral authentication and a single hub in the middle there. Now, you can see the 2 hub and spoke federations interconnect using only one connection from the federating hub there. The others, the full meshed architectures, everyone there has to do something, and let's have a look at what they have to do. It's not a lot, but they have to do it. So the Kalmar Union is actually just a list of participants, either service providers or identity providers. And the list is actually contributed from all member countries. So the top one on the left-hand side is coming from Denmark, a list of participating institutions and participating services in the Kalmar Union. Below that you have the list from Finland, the list from Norway, and the list from Sweden. And in this context you don't see Iceland because it's actually hosted by wayf in Denmark. But now we have a common set of institutions and service providers participating in the Kalmar Union. And when everybody keeps this list up to date, and they do that by simply just getting it, each hour, each day, whatever you feel like, it's all written down in the regulations, of course, with minimal requirements, but you have to keep this list of trusted entities, service providers, and identity providers. This is it. You know that you can trust them because they live up to the rules. And you can now, as a service provider, actually be listed in this list, and we will be able to receive users from the whole Nordic area, the Scandinavian area. So this is an example of how to interfederate, but keep in mind that you may also interfederate across sectors, for instance, government, health, municipalities, educational sectors, and so forth. It can be done in the same way, and it can be done regardless of the architectures that had been presented and shown to work in the Kalmar Union. If you want to be recognized but don't want to reveal your identity, you can use a pseudonym. A pseudonym is something that points to you without actually telling who you are. So let's have a look at how this can be implemented. This guy is wearing a mask, and you don't know who he is, but you will be able to recognize him if he wears the same mask next time you see him. This is a very old technology, and I will give you an example from Africa, where you can see here a party. This is in Congo, 1909, and there's a huge party going on here, and you have the medicine men pseudonymized by their masks, and you have the rest of the gang there, and you can know perfectly well, hey, these are my friends, because you recognize them as persons. You can also recognize that the medicine men are there, or the shamans are there, because they're wearing the correct masks, but you don't know who of the medicine men are actually, joining the party this time, but it's important that there is a medicine man. So they are wearing masks because they have a certain position or certain qualities that has to be present there, and then you have the rest of the people who just themselves. We can do this digitally, and this is very elegant, but a bit more non-intuitive than what you just saw in the pictures. Using identity federations, we may actually make service-specific pseudonyms for all users. So let's have a look at this. You have on the right-hand side the institution or the identity provider, which keeps information about you as a user. And then we have on the left-hand side the services, and the services, they will need to be able to recognize you, but we don't want to tell them who you are. So every time you come back, they want to recognize you and say, hey, last time you did this, and you can probably reuse some of that information if you like, or you may not do it, but anyway, the services will be able to recognize you. One important aspect here is that services should not be able to data mine across. So we have to make one pseudonym for you as a user going to service X and a different one going to service Y. They are the same each time you go to the services, but actually they're different, so the services cannot compare user databases. Now in the middle here you have wayf, the Danish Federation, which keeps a secret formula. So now we take information about you, where you want to go to and where you came from, the institution here, and then we do something magical with it, with a secret formula. And here at the bottom you see an example of such a pseudonym. This is actually me going to one of these services, and the service can receive it, look at it, look in his database and say, hey, I recognize this user. And that's the whole point, being recognized without being identified, because nobody can actually deduct my identity from this pseudonym. Now, a pseudonym is not anonymous. There's a big important difference here, and that is that you can actually be tracked. We may be able, or we are able to find out who the person is based on the pseudonym, the formula, and the input data that we started off with, which is actually telling something about you as a person, identifiable information. But the service only has the pseudonym, it does not have the formula, and it does not have the input data. The federation in the middle wave here has the formula, but it does not keep the result, because it never keeps or stores anything. So the service comes along and says, who is this user? And we say, we don't know. We only have the formula. But we may go to the institution and run through with this secret formula all data for all users, and when we find a match, we can tell who the person was. We can identify the person. So it takes 3 parties to do this trick: the service with the result, with the pseudonym, the secret formula, and the input data at the identity provider. This is a very secure setup. Usually in full meshed federations, which are different from in the way that they don't have a central federating component, the identity provider issues the pseudonym, so there can be made a direct link. If you have the result, you can actually find out very quickly. This setup is more secure because we have to get together, and these have to be very important matters, for instance, a criminal charge or something like that, before we start off this operation. So pseudonyms are practical. You may be recognized without being identified, but you should not keep the idea in your mind that you can do anything illegal and not be tracked, because that's actually one of the points here. You are not anonymous, you are operating under a pseudonym. Participating in an identity federation should be as easy as possible. And let's have a look at how easy it can be done. In the hub and spoke architecture, which is implemented by wayf in Denmark, identity providers, institutions here, has a single point of contact to the federation. They only have to set up one technical contact to the federation hub in the middle there. And the same goes for services, which also, of course, only has one single point of contact. Now, the good thing about this is, seen from a service provider's point of view, that it keeps one connection up and running, and it does not have to think about how many institutions are connected. That happens over time, and users from these connected identity providers or institutions may access the service if they will be let in by the service itself. But when a new institution is connected and they actually have a business relationship here, they may just use the existing connection here. They don't have to set up new technical installations, and they don't have to consider what kind of protocols are used in the federation. You know, C-3PO from Star Wars, he was able to, directly translate 1 million languages. That's a fantastic number. And we can actually do the same, not with 1 million languages, but we can do real-time protocol translation at the hub in the middle here. So services and institutions don't have to care about which protocols are actually being used elsewhere in the federation. So we may connect Shibboleth 1.3 service providers as well as SAML 2 service providers. We may support on the identity provider side or institution side SAML 2 connections or CAS plus LDAP or whatever. We can upgrade, downgrade, change the protocol landscape without anyone has to do anything except making sure that their own connection is actually up and running. So protocol translation is one of the key features, and the single point of contact to the federation is of course the prerequisite, but this way it's becoming very simple and very efficient to access and be member of an identity federation and take advantage of the growth of such a system. Electronic identities has to be expressed in some sort of way, and attributes is at the core of the business here. So attributes are the data fields that are being transported back and forth. It's about the user, and let's see what attributes are, what they look like, and how they can be used. So here are some data fields. There's one called David, there's one called Simonsen, that's me. There's something about my phone number, there's something about my email address, and you can imagine many, many more things that you want to express about me as a user, affiliation and so forth. So these attributes are the pieces of data which is being handled by the Identity Federation, information about me. What has to work when you set up such a system is of course a standardized way of naming these attributes, so we can actually both issue and receive standardized information. So we have to keep up with international standards to ensure that this will also work in other contexts. We cannot just find out or invent a naming of our own. And then, now this is more tricky, the meaning of these attributes, there we have to be careful, because what does it mean to be member of staff compared to be member of employee is highly different in different countries, for instance, or in different sectors. So the Identity Federation as such has to be very clear about what is the meaning of these attributes. Christian name is not so hard, family name is not so hard, but stuff like staff, employee, student, for instance. What is a student? Is it a master student, a PhD student, exchange student, and so forth? It might have different meanings in different contexts. So that's a complex field to get into. Now this is the list of attributes supported by wayf, and it's not very long compared to many other identity federations, but we keep a short list that grows use case by use case. So if you have a need for an attribute to be expressed to a service provider or received from an identity provider, you may call us and we will add to this list the needed attributes, but only if there's a real need. We can express many things. We can express email addresses, organizational nicknames, we can express your social security number, we can express the level of assurance, what type of authentication mechanism you use to log in, and so forth. Think about the simple principle of letting personal information about you going from one administrative security domain, which is the blue one, to another, the red one here. This is what it's all about. We have to move information in the form of attributes from one place to another. We do this using, to do this in a more easy way, we have defined attribute release profiles. So a release profile is the amount of data which will be issued to a service provider each time you try to access it. And you should never reveal more about yourself than really necessary. So we have, a basic principle of minimal disclosure, and this means that we find out what the purpose of the service is, and then we negotiate based on these suggested profiles what information to issue about the user. You might want to be able to recognize the user and don't know who the user really is, identify the user, or you might need to identify, even with a social security number perhaps, who the user is. So attribute release profiles in the setup of wayf is defined centrally at the federated hub. In the full meshed identity federation, it may be suggested by the federation operator what to send or issue to what service providers, but actually it's up to each identity provider to define what kind of release policy they want to have. Now, there's a question of negotiation power here. Being a central hub with all the users, hundreds of thousands or millions of users behind you, puts you in a much stronger position when negotiating what information to send over to services. And this is one important aspect of the differences between these architectures here. So we can, with a central hub, we can negotiate quite powerfully the attribute release profiles. And we make one for each service. So here we have the hub in the middle and services to the left, and they have different attribute release profiles because they're different services with different purposes. But it's one size fits all. Institution 1 cannot come along and say, we would like to issue more information to service Y. That is defined by contract by the federation operator, and it's actually written on paper and signed by the services that this is the purpose and this is the attribute release profile that we agreed upon. If they want to change it for some reason later, we can do that, but then we have to restart the whole process again. It's not very complicated, but it has to be on paper. Now, one more thing about all of this is how to express these attributes. You can do it in a machine-readable format, which is called OIDs, or you can use a more human-readable notation called URINs. It's a matter of taste. The international trend is that we go for OIDs, and that's a simple decision that was made. And then it's just important to be sure that you know that you have to follow this standard. Now the meaning, as I mentioned before, is actually very, very hard to standardize. And there you have to make sure that you and the service provider actually understand the same thing about the same issue, the same attributes. Having a hub in the middle, the federating hub, the wayf here in the middle, provides you with some good things in terms of security. You may actually know where the information originated from, and therefore a set or a calculated attribute is an attribute which is provided by the central federating hub. In this case, we have one called Shack Home Organization, and this is an attribute that tells the name of the institution or identity provider that you logged in at. Now, if the institution could itself issue this attribute, they could also spoof to be someone else or originating from somewhere else. And therefore, we have a security feature here by letting the federation operator express where the data originated from. We may do verification services in the sense that we can have an attribute called Shack Year of Birth, which is a deducted value. So you get in a social security number, for instance, which you do not want to reveal, but you can deduct the year of birth of that person, which is far less dangerous, so to speak, to issue or hand over to services. The Federation Hub can do that, and thereby we can generate more fine-grained pictures of what the users are and who they are and how old they are than we would be able to do with the raw material received from the identity provider. Or we may generate an attribute like edu-person targeted ID, which is a pseudonym, and you can see what pseudonyms are used for in one of the other presentations on this side. The Shack Home Organization, as I mentioned, is simply just a statement about where the data came from. Very useful in many contexts and highly used by many service providers. The Shack Year of Birth, here you see the social security number and the derived year of birth. Very easy. And you can take another one. You can just pass it on if actually the identity provider send over year of birth. So we can either look for information in existing attributes and extract details, or we can just pass on. Age verification is a hot topic. Not very many implement anything, but we can verify all the kind of attributes that the Identity Federation supports. So we can verify year of birth, email address, Christian name, family name, where you came from and all of that. And you can use that in, for instance, chat rooms or e-learning management systems or wherever you want to have people verifying their information. Within Identity Federations, personal information about users are being handed over from identity providers to service providers. But what about the users? How do they engage in this transaction? Now, the user's informed consent is what we're going to have a look at now. And what a consent is actually an approval, but let's get back to that. Now we have implemented systems so we can engage the user in all of this. So we want to take user information from one security domain to another, from the institution to the service provider here. That's the main thing. We want to move personal information across administrative domains. Now, there are principles. There is law in place, and there are principles for how to do this data exchange. First of all, it has to be transparent. It has to be visible. The user has to be aware that something about him is going on here. Then there has to be a legitimate purpose. Of course, you cannot just hand over any information without actually having something to do with it. There has to be a purpose, and it has to be well described. And then there has to be proportionality. Now, this is a tricky principle, but it's very important. There has to be some kind of balance between the amount of information you hand over and the purpose that it's going to be used for. So you cannot just issue a social security number to get access to, let's say, a website. This is regulated within EU. There's an EU directive which came out in 1995, so it's actually more than 15 years old, and it's being rewritten at the moment, but it's a very complicated process, so it will take some years before it's done. But be aware that there are EU regulations that has to be implemented at the national level and in the legislation. Let's have a look at some of these principles in reality. So it's called the user's informed consent, and the consent itself, the thing that the users are being confronted with must be voluntary. So there should be no arm twisting, no threats or anything like it. Here you have a man signing a paper, and it's clearly voluntary. There's only 3 large, serious men around him making sure that he signs the paper. It has to be specific. So the purpose of this transaction has to be clear. It should not be too widened out that we can use it for this and that, and we might transfer the information to others and all that. There has to be one purpose, and then it has to be informed, it has to be understandable. And this guy only has a few pages to read through before he signs, and of course that does not comply with any of what we just mentioned here. So we have to have a user dialogue which is non-threatening, specific, and simple to understand. This is difficult. The man now says, key tacit consentia videtur, which says something like, he who remains silent accepts. And that's of course also not the case, because you're not allowed to just do anything without acceptance. So let's have a look at some examples here. Voluntary. If you do not consent, we will take your money. That is of course wrong. That is not voluntary. Here's another one. Do you consent to sending a personal pseudonym, non-identifiable pointer to Google? That's much better. Let's take the other one about specificity. All services may receive your email address. Wrong. No, you cannot say that. You're not allowed to. But Google will receive your email address. This is of course much better. It's much more specific. You know what's going on, who's going to receive it, and what they're going to receive. Now, getting informed here. So it should be understandable. If you do not consent, we will not decline from not delivering no services. That's of course wrong. But you could say the same thing in a much clearer way. If you do not consent, you will not get access. That's right. Now, where the consent dialogue happens is very important, because of course it has to happen before the information about you is handed over to the service provider, the receiver. wayf implements a central consent service so that no one actually has to care about it. It's being done centrally, so the IDPs don't have to care about it. It's done centrally. The service providers, they don't have to care about it because they shouldn't care about it. This should all happen, of course, before they receive anything. If you meet a service provider that says, I will take care of the consent dialogue, be very much aware that this is not correct, because he's not allowed to handle any of this information before the user has consented, of course. Now, another part to consent is that the user must be able to withdraw the consent. At a later time, he or she should be able to actually cancel this decision. And there's let me show you 2 things here. Here's a consent dialogue presented to the user. Going to ordbogen.com, which is a web-based dictionary, you will actually be able to, you will be confronted with the text. You're about to log into the service ordbogen.com, the purpose of blah, 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 and then the information which is about to be sent over to the service is presented, and you can either click yes, I accept, no, I do not accept, and remember, you may tick a box and say, remember my consent for future use, so you will not be confronted with this dialogue each and every time. We try to keep the purpose description so short that it could fit a tweet or an SMS, something like that, very short, and we try to keep the text as simple as possible. And this is of course negotiated with the service providers, because it's their services we're talking about. And again, no one else has to think about it after that. This is a view of the consent administration. This is a personal view for each individual user, where you can go and actually have a look at all connected services, all consents, and when you click one of them, it expands. You can read the purpose of the service and see the actual values that have been sent there. You may tick or untick whether you have consented or not, so this way you're able to withdraw prior consents that you handed out. So consent is a legal thing that you have to observe. It's very important because it's about personal user information, and it has to be, the users themselves have to be able to withdraw their consents. But when you enable this, you can actually manage pretty much any personal information in the world handing it over to anyone in the world. One of the main reasons why you can trust identity federations is, of course, that they have legal arrangements, they have rules that everybody has to comply with. If they don't have that, you will only be able to have less trust in them and what is happening there. So let's have a look at what things look like in wayf legally. You have the central federation hub, you have institutions, and you have services on the left-hand side there. These are the players in the game here. Now, one important role is, of course, to be responsible for data. So the institutions here are data responsible. That's the legal term. They're data responsible for the information about all the users that they keep. Now, also, of course, the receivers, the services, are data responsible because they receive information and it's their responsibility to treat it properly. What then about the thing in the middle there, the federation operator, the wayf service? Well, it's data processor. That's a legal term too. So a data processor is someone who does something with the data on behalf of someone else. And here you see that wayf is processing information about users on behalf of many institutions because it connects many institutions, and this data then goes to another data responsible or many other data responsibles, this in the guise of service providers here. So we only have two roles. We have data responsible and data processor. The federation operator in this case is data processor on behalf of the identity providers. Now, this is actually the same diagram, but it has a little different color setting. And now you may notice something here, that there's a line down here which says possible agreement. That might be a business relationship between a service provider and an identity provider. Now, the service provider might be a very important thing here. They don't like usernames and passwords. They really want to have heavy stuff for authenticating users, so we are very sure that only the right users are getting in. So they can now issue requirements for the identity providers to actually operate several authentication mechanisms or ways to log in. Now, we have then again the trusted third party or the data processor in the middle. And we have data processor agreements that actually have nothing to do with the requirements from the service provider side about login systems, for instance. But we process all the information that is going through the system on behalf of various kinds of agreements and setups here. So the services now then make offline, so to speak, or direct agreements with the identity providers about how to use this data and other requirements. And then we have the data processor agreement, as part of the federation setup with the identity providers as well. Now, there's a different setup also that we have to consider, and these are the contracts. So, as I mentioned, there might be contracts or agreements between the service providers directly with the identity providers, but we also keep contracts between the federation operator and the services. These contracts define their relationship, their name in the in the federation context, the purpose of the service, the attribute release profiles, and the requirements in legal rights and obligations. So these are real contracts done on a bilateral basis between the data processor and the service providers. So how do these contracts then inflict on the data flows of the system? Well, it's an opt-out system, which is a legal term. You may have opt-out or opt-in. Opt-out means that everything is open. You may actually access all services from start on. And then you may opt out and say, well, we don't want our users to access service X, and we can change that. So we shut down a connection, for instance, from institution 2 to service X. Users from institution 1 will still be able to actually access service X, but it's opt-out, so they have to be aware of services and how they behave and make sure that it complies with their policies. If not, anyone will be able to use the architecture as they like. wayf som identitetsfederation giver mulighed for, at man kan integrere de tjenester, som er koblet på wayf, ind i lokale single sign-on-systemer eller lokale linksamlinger på en meget transparent og elegant måde. Det skal vi kigge på nu. Her kan vi se, at vi har tjenester ude på venstre side. De er koblet til wayf, og vi har institutioner eller identitetsudbydere på højre side. Og det kan faktisk være institutioner, der har egne single sign-on-systemer. Og nu skal vi se, hvad der sker, når en bruger først logger ind på institutionen. Det kan være almindelig arbejde med at lave webmail eller den slags. Lige så snart man er logget ind, træder det lokale single sign-on-system i kraft og giver adgang til alle de tjenester, som drives lokalt på stedet der. Nu er vi altså inde på institutionen. Vi har mulighed for at komme ind i linksamlingen, og det man så kan gøre i den linksamling er at lave nogle særligt smarte links, som ikke bare peger på tjenester, der er koblet på wayf, men også indeholder flere oplysninger, så det bliver helt transparent for brugeren om hvorvidt tjenesten enten er en intern eller så at sige en ekstern wayf-tjeneste. Og det der sker er, at når man klikker på et link i linksamlingen, ja, så bliver der sendt en forespørgsel afsted til tjenesten. Det er ganske almindelig kutyme, eller gør som man plejer. Men linket indeholder 3 led. Det indeholder selvfølgelig først og fremmest navnet på den tjeneste, man vil hen på. Derudover indeholder det en parameter om, at der skal altså peges ned på wayf. Og det er den røde pil her, den peger ned på wayf, fordi det er her, vi skal logge ind. Og så indeholder det et tredje link, og det er altså Identity Provider nummer 1, vi taler om her. Nu er det lidt svært at se, men rent faktisk er det tredje led i den lange URL, der blev genereret inden til at starte med, og den peger op på institutionen. Og nu sker der det interessante, at brugerens browser rent faktisk først går til tjenesten, så går til wayf, og derefter automatisk går op til institutionen igen. Men da der allerede er single sign-on, som vi kan se med den store blå boble her, der er etableret single sign-on, så bliver svaret returneret umiddelbart, og uden at brugeren opdager noget som helst. Ned til wayf bliver der sendt oplysninger om brugeren, og de bliver sendt videre til tjenesten. Og tjenesten kan så lukke brugeren ind, eller lade være, hvis det ikke er en bruger, der får lov til at komme ind. Det eneste, der sker hos wayf undervejs på vejen tilbage, er eventuelt at spørge brugeren om samtykke til udlevering af de her oplysninger. Hvis der er gemt et samtykke i forvejen, vil man ved et enkelt klik i den lokale linksamling få direkte adgang til tjenesten, uden at opdage noget som helst. Den opmærksomme slutbruger vil muligvis se op i adressefeltet, at der sker en masse ting og sager, men det er sådan set helt naturligt, fordi der foregår også en masse ting og sager. Det er den ene måde, man kan lave den her slags transparent integration på. Den anden måde bliver kaldt for heimat, og heimat det betyder sådan set hjemstavn, der hvor jeg kommer fra. Vi kigger igen på, hvad der sker, når brugeren logger ind først lokalt. Der sker nemlig følgende. Brugeren logger ind på den lokale institution, og der bliver etableret et single sign-on domæne, hvor man kan bruge alle de lokale tjenester. Samtidig bliver der sendt en besked, eller hvad skal man sige, et uopfordret svar til føderationen wayf i midten, med oplysninger om netop denne her bruger. Så faktisk bliver der etableret, uden at nogen lægger mærke til det, et meget større single sign-on domæne. Der bliver nemlig etableret et domæne, der også omfatter føderationen wayf. Nu er brugeren inde på portalen, eller den lokale linksamling, og klikker på et link, som peger hen på en tjeneste. Men læg nu mærke til, at det her link er lidt kortere end det, vi så på før. Det indeholder nemlig kun 2 ting. Navnet på tjenesten, naturligvis, og navnet på det sted, hvor man kan logge ind, som er wayf. Og når man så rent faktisk klikker der, ja, så vil man jo blive selvfølgelig viderestillet til wayf, men da der allerede ligger oplysninger i wayf her, så vil svaret gå lynhurtigt tilbage til tjenesten, eventuelt igen med en brugersamtykke ind imellem der. Hvis man har gemt sit brugersamtykke, så vil man selvfølgelig ikke opleve det, og så vil man igen faktisk en lille smule hurtigere endnu end i forhold til det tidligere eksempel, få mulighed for at få direkte adgang til tjenesten. For nu at give et eksempel på, hvordan det kan gøres, eller for at vise jer, hvor let det er, så vil jeg vise jer, hvad der sker, hvis man nu går ind på en linksamling som denne her. Det her er en browser, og jeg skal nu logge ind på RUC, Roskilde Universitets single sign-on system, for at få adgang til deres Portalino, som er deres linksamling. Så nu logger jeg ind med brugernavn og kodeord, og jeg bliver viderestillet ind til linksamlingen, som ser sådan her ud. Det er min private linksamling, og herunder er der faktisk adgang til ordbogen, en ordbog. Og nu må I lige huske på, at jeg er logget ind på institutionen. Institutionen har, uden at vi kunne se det, sendt en besked til føderationen, til wayf, med mine personoplysninger. Og når jeg nu klikker på det her link, så skal I se, hvad der sker. Vupti, så kommer jeg ind på ordbogen. Og det gik meget nemt, men der er rent faktisk tale om, at jeg nu er logget ind med et fødereret login via wayf på en ekstern tjeneste i forhold til institutionen, jeg er logget ind på. Det her kan lade sig gøre med alle de tjenester, der er på wayf, og wayf fungerer i sig selv også som single sign-on domæne i forhold til alle de tjenester, der er koblet på. Så brugerne får det meget nemt ved at bruge eksterne tjenester i form af wayf-tjenester, når man laver links på den her måde. You may use the Identity Federation wayf to do transparent service integration of the federated services into local environments like single sign-on domains and link collections. Let's have a look at how that can be done. First, the setup here, we have, of course, the services, the federated services. On the left-hand side, we have wayf, the federating component, in the middle here, and then we have institutions or identity providers on the right-hand side. One of them, number one, has a local single sign-on system with services attached to it. So when the user goes to one of these, they of course go to the login system here, and we have, because of the single sign-on motor, created a domain where you don't have to re-authenticate when you go to different services. This is all very good, working very well, and this is also where people keep their internal link collections. So if you want to now integrate one of the external federated services into this link collection in an easy way, you may use pointing links. A pointing link resides in the link collection and points, of course, to the service. But it has more to it. It also points to where you want to log in, and that is the federation. So the link goes actually to the service first, then it points to the federating component, the wayf, which is the red arrow corresponding to the red part of the link, and then in turn it keeps also a third information, which is which institution you want to log into. And of course you want to log into the same institution where you already logged in. Now, as the single sign-on system is already operating, you have a session there, the information can be issued back to the federation and then back to the service, which can then let you in. So it happens very quickly and completely transparent to the user that you actually either use services internal to the single sign-on domain or external services via the federation. The only thing that can come in between here is, of course, the consent dialog about the information about the user being handed over to the service. If the user has already consented and asked the federation to store that consent, there will be no user interaction whatsoever. They will just be redirected directly to the service. A different concept, but the same functionality in principle, is called Heimat. Heimat means the place you come from originally. And what happens here is, of course, again, that the user goes to the local institution, they create a session with the single sign-on domain, and then here comes the difference. The single sign-on motor issues a response with personal information about the user to the federation, and hereby also creates a session with the federation, and in effect actually expanding the single sign-on domain of the local institution. So when the user now goes to the link collection, the link might look a little different, a little more simple than the other one we just looked at. Here you go. First of all, it points, of course, to the service. So you in the browser gets redirected to the service, but it also points to the federation wayf. Now, what happens then is, of course, that wayf already have a session going and the information about you, so that it can issue back immediately the information here to the service. Again, the consent dialog might come in between, but otherwise it goes very fast. So let's have a look at it. It's implemented, and I would like to give you an example. So I click on Roskilde University's Portalino, which is a link collection. It's a protected resource, so I will have to log in first, of course, using my username and password. Like so. Now I get to the link collection, and here we are. And I can do many things. I can read my webmail. I can go to all kinds of services, group management services, and so forth. And an important one is, of course, the dictionary, which is a federated service operated by an external company. So if I click on this link, you will see that actually I'm getting redirected immediately, and I go to this service, and there's actually no interaction whatsoever from the user side. So here we have integrated an external service via the federation into a local link collection, and nobody really notices. Well, someone might see in the address field of the browser that there are redirects happening, but that's actually very normal these days, and nobody will actually tell the difference. So you can now integrate federated services into local systems or environments very easily using pointing links or Heimat.